Hi, I'm Nick Weber, and today I'm going to talk about getting out of debt. Right now, there are millions of Americans who are struggling with their debt, and for many of these people, this debt burden is always on their mind and it follows them wherever they go. This burden can lead to extreme stress, which can wreak havoc on a person's relationships or even their health. Therefore, I think it is critical for someone to ensure they get out of debt as soon as possible and employ strategies to keep their debt eliminated. Let's say someone got into $25,000 of credit card debt and stayed in that debt over a 30-year period. Over that time frame, they would have reasonably paid $150,000 in credit card interest alone. But if they didn't have that debt and were able to actually invest those interest payments instead, they could have reasonably had $511,286 at the end of that same time frame. In this video, we're going to be discussing getting out of most consumer debts, such as credit cards. However, you can still use my concepts on things like home, car, and student loans. Also, before you can efficiently tackle your debt, you need to have a budget so you know how much you can afford to spend on your debt each month. If you haven't already done so, I highly recommend you watch my budgeting video and take that first step before continuing on to try and eliminate your debt. Now, let's discuss how most people manage their debt. Let's go through a hypothetical scenario regarding your credit card debt. Let's say you have $25,000 in debt spread across multiple credit cards, and you have $1,000 in your bank account. And let's say your average credit card interest rate is 20% and your minimum credit card payment is $750 a month. What happens for most people struggling with debt is this: they hate their debt and they hate paying this interest, which is about $5,000 a year. So they try to make as big of payments to their debts as they can afford to make each month. And you know what? They actually start to chip away at their debts. Let's say you're making payments of $1,500 a month to your cards, even though the minimum payment is $750. Also, in this scenario, your interest for the month is $417, so only $1,083 actually went to the principal. Anyway, now let's say you make these payments for a few months. Then, inevitably, something that requires more money from you than what you have in the bank arises, right? Let's say your car breaks down, you need new equipment for work, your roof started leaking, or you were invited to a friend's destination wedding. Anyway, it's something unexpected, and this something costs $4,000. Now you're back to where you started. But you feel okay because you've been here before. It's not the end of the world, you'll just start over. Now you're going at it again, and several months down the road, a new unexpected expense pops up. But again, it's okay, you've been in $25,000 of debt before, so let's start over again. But then this happens over again and again. This is known by some as the debt spiral. And this example is a very real reality for most people who are struggling with debt. Well, I have a solution to this. What I suggest is, instead of making extra payments to your debt, make the minimum payments instead. And I know you're going to say, Nick, wait, this is crazy. I have high interest rates on my cards and I'm paying $5,000 a year in interest. Shouldn't I throw all the money I can at my cards to pay them off to avoid this interest? That's a great point, but how's that been working out for you so far? Of course the goal is to not pay interest. That's why we're trying to eliminate the debt, but we're playing the get out of debt game now and not the interest rate game. The reason why most people are in debt initially is because they lack the patience and want instant gratification, or there was an unexpected financial emergency, or they chose to not live within their means. The main reason why most people stay in debt are due to lack of budgeting and not having a cash reserve. It's very hard for many people to have a cash reserve because if they see money in the bank, they spend it. And having money sit in your bank and earning little to no interest is so painful and boring that they feel their opportunity cost is better off doing anything but keep the money in the bank. I think people hate the term cash reserve almost as much as they hate budgeting. But the cash reserve is what saves your finances in the long run. I think of the cash reserve as investment and debt insurance. It's the money that prevents you from going into debt or liquidating your investments at an unfavorable time. When it comes to a cash reserve, of course we'd like to make money on it, but its purpose is to be there and available immediately whenever you need it, not to grow. Think of the lack of growth as the insurance cost that can save you from liquidating your assets or taking on more debt. Before we get going, I also highly recommend you do a budget before you tackle your debt. It's critical to know how efficient you can be with your money and to know how much you can afford to make in terms of debt and savings payments. If you're struggling to just make your minimum debt payments, then perhaps you should consider talking to a debt counselor and/or a bankruptcy attorney. Okay, so now instead of paying the full $1,500 a month towards your debt, you should make the minimum payment to your debts and put the rest of the money towards your cash reserve instead. This time, let's say that the same financial emergency happens a few months down the road. Well, here you have money in your cash reserve to cover that expense. And guess what? Your debt is lower and you didn't go back to ground zero. Now let's continue this path for a while. And now let's say sometime down the road, you have $15,000 in your cash reserve and you owe $15,000 on your credit cards. Now, what do? Most people would say, pay off the debt. And if that is your answer, then you haven't learned the lesson quite yet. Because if you did use your whole cash reserve to pay off the debt, I'm certain on the next day, your car would break down and you would be back in debt all over again. What you need to do is you wait until your debt is lower than your cash reserve by an acceptable buffer, and you need to make sure that the buffer is reached before paying off your debt. This buffer is critical because it gives you the cash reserve to cover most unexpected expenses so you can avoid going into debt or liquidating your assets as soon as you pay off your debt. I think an acceptable buffer is $5,000. The final step here is you build your cash reserve to the acceptable cash reserve amount and hopefully never go into debt ever again. The only way you can get out of debt and stay out of debt is by having a cash reserve, also known as an emergency fund. And it's not a matter of if you have a financial emergency, but when you have one. Financial emergencies happen all the time. You must have a cash reserve, otherwise you are doomed to struggle with debt. For guidance on your cash reserve account, please watch my cash reserve video. Now, let's go over one last option regarding your debt scenario. I still recommend you make the minimum credit card payments and save the remainder into your cash reserve. However, once you grow your cash reserve into a large enough reserve buffer, and again, I think $5,000 is usually acceptable, then I think it's okay and reasonable to start attacking your debt with as much money as possible each month. I find this approach acceptable because even though we don't have an ideal cash reserve yet, the cash buffer we do have at this point is now hopefully enough to cover most short-term expenses, and therefore this allows you to use your cash reserve money to cover an emergency instead of increasing debt. If you do have another financial emergency and you spend your buffer cash reserve, then you will need to make minimum payments on your debt again and start the strategy over until you have your buffer back at the $5,000 level. Then you would start aggressively paying down your debt again. If you are using this method and making aggressive payments to your debt, I recommend using the debt snowball strategy. The debt snowball method is where you have multiple debts and each debt has a different balance and interest rate linked to it. Using your debt payment monthly budget, you would then allocate your money to the minimum payments for each debt, and then excess money allocated to your debt payments would all go to either the smallest debt or the one with the highest interest rate. You would then continue making your debt payments this way until the first debt is completely paid off. Then you allocate all of the excess funds to the next debt with either the smallest balance or the highest interest rate, and then continue this pattern until all of your debts are wiped out. Think of this method like a snowball rolling down a snowy hill. As time goes on, the snowball collects more and more snow and gets bigger and bigger. In this strategy, the payments to your debt start small, and as each debt is paid off, the debt payment gets bigger and bigger, just like the snowball, until you're making sizable debt payments and quickly wiping out your last debt balances. If you're interested in this method, there are plenty of debt snowball calculators and programs online if you want to calculate which snowball method is the most efficient for your scenario. I think the critical takeaway is that the only way to get out of debt and stay out of debt is by having a cash reserve. It's also critical to practice good budgeting fundamentals or to at least live below your means. Otherwise, you will be doomed to be in debt again in the future, and the pain and agony of a lot of debt is absolutely not worth the short-term pleasure of living above your means. I highly recommend that once you get out of debt, you cut up your credit cards and start budgeting for as many of or all of your big expenses as possible, like your next car, your home remodel, or your next vacation. Having debt creates huge inefficiencies in your budget and financial plan, and avoiding debt as much as possible will allow you to enjoy so much more of your money. How crazy is it to use a credit card for things like a dinner out and then potentially pay 20% interest for years on a meal that you ate years ago? Also, I don't recommend people get points and travel mile credit cards with the intent to pay them off each month either. These credit card companies are counting on you to have a financial emergency or fall onto hard times and stop paying the full balance each month and start carrying a credit card balance, and then it gets you to pay them large amounts of interest. To ensure the greatest chance of financial success, you need to live with the mantra, I don't spend money I don't have. Trust me, spending easy, accessible money you don't have today is not the path to a better life. The better life is the one that makes interest work for them and not against them. Now, if you haven't already, I highly recommend you watch my budgeting and cash reserve videos to help expedite your path to affluence. My goal is to help more people become affluent through education and asset management. I hope that you find these videos extremely helpful and can use this information to work towards becoming affluent on your own. If you get tired of doing your own research or don't have the time and energy to manage your own strategies and assets, then let my team help. We work with clients all over the United States and can help you virtually so you can work towards becoming affluent from the comfort of your own home or office. To learn more about our services, visit my website at www.nickweberwealth.com.